Maybe if I move a little bit closer. All right. I'm catching reverb personally, so I'm going to blame those guys. Romans chapter 9, verse 11, Romans chapter 9 through 11 is a long argument trying to answer this question. What about the Jews who don't believe in Jesus? Paul has been answering this question from Old Testament historical narratives and explaining Moses and the prophets. The Jews sought righteousness through law-keeping and moral adherence, righteousness that was self-produced. But Paul quoted Moses to counter this argument. In Romans chapter 10, 9 and 10, we looked at this last week. Paul said, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Our salvation is a matter of the heart, not one that is concerned with self-righteousness and law-keeping, but a heart for God that truly believes that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. This is what the Jews stumbled over. They struggled with a Messiah that suffered and died and rose again. At the end of class last week, we saw Paul quote from Joel chapter 2, that same passage that Peter used to explain the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the last days and at Pentecost. And in Romans chapter 10, verse 13, Paul said, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Everyone who calls. God's salvation was not just to be exclusive for the Jewish nation in the end. It was to be for the whole world, Jew and Gentile, who turns their heart in faith to God will be saved. Paul's thoughts on this continue from this glorious message, and he goes into 4 rhetorical questions. And that's where we're going to pick up this morning. Beginning in verse 14. Romans chapter 10, verse 14. Paul says, how then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. Now, these verses are most frequently used as a pattern for missions and evangelistic efforts, and for good reason. These are the logical steps in any evangelistic effort. Usually this is presented in reverse order to our congregations like ours. One must be sent first so that they can preach. And preaching here is a verb in the text. It's an action word. It's the action that it means to herald a message. In times of kings, a herald was a royal official of the court, and he would go out and proclaim the victories of a king all over a town square. It's that guy with that big booming voice. He would say, hear ye, hear ye, hear ye, and then tell of the great things that the king has done. So someone must first be sent, and someone must preach as to be heard, and one must hear as to believe, and one must believe then to call on the name of the Lord to be saved. These are the logical steps. If the gospel of Christ is going to go out into an unbelieving population, then this is the pattern that must be followed. But Paul frames this truth in reverse order and in the form of questions. And they're accusatory questions. This rhetorical accusation is coming from the Jew who does not believe in Jesus. That Jew might say, how was I supposed to know? How was I supposed to come to believe in Jesus so as to call on him and be saved? following their logic, they are actually leveling an accusation against God. We can't call on Jesus to be saved because you didn't send a preacher to tell us about Jesus or this good news. And Paul's response to this accusation is a quote from Isaiah. God said to Isaiah, "Who shall we send?" And Isaiah actually volunteered and he said, "Here am I, send me." This is the preacher that was sent to Israel. Romans 10, verse 15, Paul quotes Isaiah 52, verse 7, when he says, "As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." Now, this verse on its own reflects the beauty of the gospel message going out. And we're going to see this more clearly in a minute. But the broad context from which Paul pulls this passage shows that God did send the gospel message to the Jews, to Israel. And he did teach them about Jesus. Now, the context of this quote starts in Isaiah chapter 51. We're going to go through a lengthy section in Isaiah to really get a full picture here. Now, in this passage, the prophet is looking into the future at God's people in Babylonian captivity, and he's pleading for their release, and he's seeing their redemption. Now, this event is 130 to 150-ish years in front of Isaiah into the future. And as the prophet is describing this major event and he's peering into the prophetic future, he's calling for and pleading with God for something that looks like what happened in Egypt. And he's looking forward to this captivity and this redemption, but it kind of looks like the cross of Christ. Now, this is because God uses the same methods to redeem. His pattern repeats. So the redemption in Egypt looks a little like the redemption from Babylon, which looks a lot like what the cross of Christ is going to look like. God uses the same pattern to save all throughout history, so everybody knows that it's God who is doing the saving. So Isaiah is remembering the exodus from Egypt in the past. He's seeing the future exodus from Babylon, and both of them are pointing to the final exodus from sin, empowered by the Messianic King. Isaiah begins in 51, verses 1 and 2, and he says this: "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness. You who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who bore you. For he was but one when I called him, that I might bless him and multiply him." So Isaiah is calling to attention those who are pursuing righteousness. Not by law keeping, not by moral adherence, checking the boxes, but righteousness through faith. And he says, we need people who are chiseled out of the same type of rock as Abraham and Sarah. Same rock that they were chiseled out of. Paul has covered this comprehensively in Romans chapter 4. Cody covered this for us. Romans chapter 4, verse 13. Paul said, "For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir to the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith." So Isaiah, Moses, and Paul agree. Righteousness is by faith, patterned after Abraham. So this call is going out to the faithful in captivity to listen up. Everybody of faith, listen up. Zion is in ruins. Jerusalem has been destroyed. God is coming, and he is going to give comfort to the faithful remnant. Now, Isaiah continues in verse 3. "For the Lord comforts Zion. He comforts all of her wasted places, and he makes her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. So God's arrival in this redemptive effort is described as the great reversal of the curse that was levied upon the world in Genesis chapter 3. Deserts and wilderness are going to be turned back into the Garden of Eden, and this garden is going to be filled with joy and gladness. Then in verse 7, Isaiah says, "Listen to me, you who know righteous, the people in whose heart is my law. Fear not the reproach of man, nor be dismayed at their revilings." So Isaiah's call is for people to know righteousness, that have God's law, not just with checking the boxes, but to have the law in the heart. Understand who God is and what God is doing through this law. Paul said in Romans that the majority of the Jews sought righteousness without knowledge. They never understood what the law was for or what it pointed to. And so Isaiah is trying to wake up this remnant of faithful people, people who from the heart still have faith in God. And now the rest of this section in Isaiah is broken up into 3 stanzas where the prophet says, "Awake, awake," so that the faithful can see what God is doing for them. So in verse 9, Isaiah 51, verse 9. "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab into pieces and who pierced the dragon?" Now the prophet Isaiah is calling on the strong arm of the Lord to deliver in salvation. And he's pleading with God's strength to do what you did in the past. And he references this thing that God did long ago, cutting Rahab in pieces and piercing the dragon. These are parallel thoughts, and they're the same action being described in 2 ways. When Isaiah says that God cut Rahab into pieces, this is not talking about Rahab that hid the spies in Jericho. It's a different Hebrew spelling. This is Rahab the sea monster or dragon. Now the psalmist, King David wrote this psalm in 89, verses 9 and 10, and he said something very, very similar to what Isaiah is saying here. He told God, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass, and you scattered your enemies with your mighty arm." So Rahab represents a kingdom. The sea dragon represents Egypt and Pharaoh. And many of the Old Testament writers were familiar with this type of language. And it was not uncommon for evil nations to be described as beasts coming up out of the sea. The prophet Daniel saw all the future kingdoms in front of him as beasts coming up out of the sea. So Isaiah is using this language to awaken God's strong arm of redemption and deliverance. And he's calling for God to act as a redeemer like he did in Egypt when he destroyed Pharaoh. The passage right after this in Isaiah, I'm not going to read it, but he talks about them walking across on the dry ground when the Red Sea is split. He's talking about Egypt. Now, the reason that Isaiah desires this is because of all of the horrible state that he sees God's people in the future captivity. He's calling for God to help in delivering them from their terrible situation. Isaiah 51, verse 17. He says, "Awake yourself, wake yourself. Stand up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, who has drunk to the dregs the bowl, the cup of staggering. There is none to guide her. Among all the sons she has borne, there is none to take her by the hand among all the sons she has brought up." So Isaiah sees God's people in the future is identified as Jerusalem, and they're all drunk. Not with wine, but they're drunk on God's wrath. God has given his wrath to them in a cup. And they have violated the covenant. And all of the curses that Moses said would fall on them are being fully employed here. So Babylonian captivity is seen as God's wrath in a cup. And God hands it to them, and they're drinking it, and they're drinking it. And they drank it until they were completely incapacitated by it. There's nothing that they can do to remedy them. Jerusalem is staggering drunk, and all of her offspring are laying on the ground, passed out. And Isaiah is shaking them, and he's saying, "Wake up, wake up, wake up." In verse 22, "Thus says the Lord, your God who pleads the cause of his people. Behold, I have taken from your hand the cup of staggering. The bowl of my wrath you shall drink no more." So now we hear in God's redemption, we see a great reversal. And take note, it is God who does the acting. Jerusalem will not stop drinking, so God reaches down and takes the cup of wrath out of her hand. And in doing so, he reverses the wrath and puts it on someone else. It is poured out onto Jerusalem's tormentors and onto the evil nation around them. This is God's gracious action. They didn't deserve this. It is God showing mercy when they didn't deserve mercy. God fulfilling promises that he made long ago. Now, this action by God in taking his wrath away is cause for celebration. And Isaiah continues in 52, verses 1 and 2. He says, "Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For there shall no more come unto you the uncircumcised and the unclean. Shake off the dust and arise. Be seated, O Jerusalem. Loose the bonds of your neck, O captive daughters of Zion." Now, because of God's actions, Jerusalem has gone through this great transformation. From being drunk and passed out on the ground, shackled with a chain of bondage around their neck, ruled by the uncircumcised and the unclean. But now, by God's power, they are clean. They are dressed in festal garments. They are seated on Mount Zion where God's king is coming to reign. Now, this is the verse that Paul picks up in Romans chapter 10. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7 and 8. Isaiah says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. In the voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voices. Together they sing for joy, for eye to eye they see the return of the Lord of Zion." So Isaiah is seeing into the future, and it is a terrible, terrible time. Jerusalem is in ruins. The people have been in captivity, suffering under God's wrath because of their sin. And in the process, God had departed from them. Now God has taken action, just like he did in Egypt. He has stretched out his strong arm of salvation, and he has redeemed them. He has taken away their wrath through mercy and grace, and he is returning to reign as king in Zion. Isaiah describes this, what the faithful watcher sees, that faithful person that is watching for the king. He's sitting in ruins. He is in a hopeless and he's in a desperate situation. And he sees a person running far off on the horizon over the top of the mountain. And the messenger is shouting, "God is coming to save us. Our King is coming to save us." And that is what Paul is talking about when he quotes Isaiah. He says in Romans chapter 10, verse 15, "How beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." You may have noticed in this passage that it is God who does all of the saving. It is God's strong arm that takes action in redemption. It is God who removes his wrath from the faithful, and he places his wrath on someone else, redeeming you from bondage and setting you in a renewed Zion around the throne of God. It is under God's kingship and around his throne that all of the good news is realized. And in the next verse, Isaiah presents God's servant, who is the exalted king coming to Zion. In Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13 and 15, it says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. And as many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told to them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand." Now Isaiah uses this phrase to describe the servant. It's the same phrase that he used to describe Jehovah when he saw God in the temple. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, Isaiah said, In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up, and his train of his robe filled the temple. When God says that his servant is going to be high and lifted up and exalted, God is saying that this servant is the king that the good news is about. This is the king that is returning to Zion. This is the king of whom the messengers run across the mountains to proclaim his victories. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. The king is coming to save. But there is a shocking thing about this servant king, an astonishing thing. He's marred. He is disfigured so badly that he's hard to recognize as human. But it is by this marring, it is by these disfiguring wounds that the servant king cleanses many nations. Now back in Romans, Paul is going to pick up his argument. Keep all that in mind. Romans chapter 10, verse 16. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. They talking about the Jews that don't believe. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing the word of Christ. So the rhetorical complaint from the unbelieving Jew is this: we never heard about Jesus. You never sent us a preacher. But Paul takes them back and reminds them of Isaiah and how beautifully he presented the gospel message of Christ to them. Despite Isaiah's best efforts, not everybody believed. And Isaiah knew this. And Paul quotes him in the very next verse. And Isaiah is talking to God. In Isaiah chapter 53, verse 1, this is what Paul's quoting. This is right after he introduced the servant king that is marred. Isaiah said, who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? God has sent his preachers. They have proclaimed the good news of Christ, but when Christ was presented, it was not the king that they wanted or expected. That very message in Isaiah is the next message or passage is the suffering servant passages, detailing out the description of why our king is so marred and so disfigured. And when you read through it, you realize it's your fault. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. God in his mercy takes his cup of wrath away from you, and he gives it to Christ. And Christ willingly drinks it. When Jesus was in the garden, he prayed to the Father and he said, "Let this cup pass from me. Not my will, but thine be done." And there was no other way. And so Jesus took the cup and he drank it, and he drank it, and he drank it until it was dry, so that we can have peace with God, and so that we can be healed. Our faith comes from hearing this message. Paul said, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. It is the message that Moses proclaimed. It is the message that Isaiah proclaimed. It is the message that Paul is proclaiming. Now, Paul goes on, chapter 10, verse 18. And he says, but I ask, have they not heard? Indeed, they have. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Paul is asking a rhetorical question. Have they, the unbelieving Jews, have they not heard this message that has been proclaimed? He said, yes, they have. They've heard it from Moses, they've heard it from Isaiah, they heard it from the apostles. Then he quotes Psalm chapter 19 to answer himself. Psalm 19. This is a psalm of David. He says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all of the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Now, this psalm talks about the created world declaring God's glory. And you are without excuse when it comes to the existence of God, his glory, and his power. Every day and every night, when the sun rises and falls, you cannot deny that there is a God and that he is powerful. Creative revelation is universal, and it is complete. No one is unaware of it. And Paul is using this passage to show how extensively and universal the gospel of Christ was to the Jews. The Gentiles are without excuse of knowing that there's a God because the sun rises and falls every day. And the Jews are without excuse because they heard Christ from Moses, Isaiah, and Paul. From the very beginning to the very end, they have heard it, and they are without excuse. Paul confirms that they heard the message, but then he asks another rhetorical question in verse 19. But I asked, did Israel not understand? And first Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation I will make you angry. Paul's saying, did Israel not understand the message? Did they not understand what was going to happen? Did they not grasp this? And the answer he has comes from Deuteronomy chapter 32. This is a song that Moses taught to the Israelites, and it was to help them remember all of the sermons that he preached to them in Deuteronomy. They were supposed to teach their children this song. Everyone was to know this song. And the song starts out about how great God is, how perfect and just and upright he is. But then it kind of goes downhill after that. It's not a very catchy song. It goes on to how treacherous Israel is, and their actions were like adultery before God. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, Moses said, "And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom there is no faithfulness. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation." Now, Israel was clearly taught that a heart of faithfulness toward God led to blessing. But God said, these people have no faith. They turn to idols and they provoke me. They make God jealous through spiritual adultery. So God said, I'm going to make them jealous by turning my mercies on another nation, the Gentiles. Have they heard Christ? Paul's asking. Yes, they have. The law, the prophets, and the apostles have all talked to them about this. Did they understand the consequences of rejecting God's gospel? Yes, they did. Everybody knew the song. Everybody knew the song. Now Paul goes to Isaiah to finish this section of his argument. In Romans chapter 10, verse 20 and 21, he says, "Then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. But of Israel," he says, "all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrite people." This quote comes from Isaiah chapter 65, verses 1 and 2. And in the preceding passage, Isaiah, the prophet, is again looking into the future at the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem after the people have been taken into captivity. The temple has been burned to the ground. The place of worship has been destroyed because of the people's sin, and all of the curses that Moses said would come upon them for their spiritual adultery have come to pass. And Isaiah is speaking to God, and he says, will you restrain yourself at these things, O Lord? Will you keep silent? Will you afflict us so terribly? He just could not believe how bad everything was. And God's answer to Isaiah is this, chapter 65, verses 1 and 2. And God says, I permitted myself to be sought by those who did not ask for me, and I permitted myself to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation which did not call my name. I have spread out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in the way which is not good, following their own thoughts. Isaiah is explaining what Moses warned of in his song, that he would make Israel jealous by extending his mercies to the Gentiles. The Gentiles didn't ask for God, but God decided to show his mercy to them because of Israel's adultery. And the Gentiles didn't seek after God, but God decided to reveal himself. God shouted to the Gentiles through the gospel of Christ and said, here I am. And they all responded, and they came and called on his name. The Jews had overwhelming privilege and revelation from God. They heard the gospel through Moses and the law. They heard the gospel from Isaiah and the prophets, and they knew the consequences of violating the covenant because everybody knew the song. And they stumbled over Jesus. And God said, I have spread out my hands all day long to this rebellious people, and they are without excuse. That is the class for today. In 2 weeks, we will pick up in chapter 11. Thank you.